You are listening to Edvane Stories. Tonight's tale is The 7 Blessings of Cecily Scratcher, Part 1. Monday's child is fair of face. The child was brought out of St Mildred's in a cold, grey rain, wrapped in linen clean enough to shame the street. Bread Street steamed around the baptism party with noise, horses and neighbours slowing just enough to pretend they were not watching. The mother came first, pale from childbed and holding the bundle tightly. Her husband walked beside her with his hat in both hands. Behind them came the godparents and 2 women from the parish who had already stored away the child's name, the mother's colour, and whether the father had looked pleased enough. Cecily Scratcher waited beneath the lychgate. No one asked why she was there. Cecily had delivered too many infants and washed too many dead to be turned aside at either end of life. Her cap was pulled down and her old face fixed upon the linen bundle. "What day?" she asked. The mother blinked. "Today, Mistress Scratcher. The minister is just—" "Not the washing," Cecily said. "The first breath." A little relief moved through them. They knew the game then. Even with the king dead and godly seriousness pressed into public life, old rhymes were permitted if they came from old mouths. "Monday," said the mother, "before dawn." Cecily nodded. "Monday's child is fair of face." The godmother smiled and drew back the linen. The child's cheeks were pink from the cold, her lashes dark, and her mouth working softly after milk. One neighbour leaned in and called her pretty. The father gave a pleased cough, as though prettiness was something entered under his own name. Cecily watched them admire the child. Then she said, "Mind it, then. A fair face has more owners than the child knows." Cecily had not lifted her voice, yet the small party had silenced, and those who pretended not to listen had forgotten their pretence. "There was another Monday child," she said, "baptized here when your own mother was no higher than the churchyard wall. Grace Long, they called her. A clean name for a clean face, folk thought." Grace had been fair before she had words to spend. Not angel fair, nor the painted kind hung in rich men's halls. Fair enough for Bread Street, though. Clear skin she had, bright eyes, brown curls, and a small, perfect mouth. People paused over her. That was all at first. A neighbour would ask to hold her a moment longer. A baker's wife would press a sugared crust into her hand. A pewterer, hard with other men's debts, would soften when Grace was brought to the door. "Pretty child," they said, and meant no harm by it, which is often how harm begins. Her mother learned to smooth Grace's cap before stepping out. Her father, who sold thread, pins and small household trifles from the lower room, learned that customers lingered when the child sat down with a sampler. If a bill stood unpaid, Grace might be sent down to fetch a measure of tape. If a neighbour came angry over something borrowed but not returned, Grace would be asked to bring the stool, or the cup, or simply herself. No one said they were using her. They called it charm, or providence, or God's favour upon the house. They smiled when they said it, and Mercy smiled back, because children learn what is expected of them long before they know its price. "Her face," Cecily said, "began to earn before her hands did." By the time Grace Long was 12, the parish had ceased to praise her as it praised a child, and had begun to judge her as it judged a woman. Nothing in her face had changed enough to explain it. Her skin was still clear, her eyes still bright, her curls still lay in the careful order her mother worked into them each morning. Yet the looks she drew no longer ended with kindness. Men who had once patted her head now looked and then looked away too slowly. Women who had once called her a lamb corrected the fall of her hair and the quickness of her smile. Her mother told her not to laugh so readily in the street, then pinched her wrist when a creditor came calling, and whispered that she must not stand there like a doorpost. "Smile, Grace, it costs nothing." But it did. It cost in ways no account book would take. Her father began to fear the very thing he had profited from. If she came down to the shop when customers were present, he watched their eyes and frowned after they had gone. If she stayed above, he sent for her when a softer face might sweeten a harder bargain. He spoke of reputation as if it were a pane of glass Grace carried in both hands, though it was others who were throwing the stones. Once, a young apprentice from Friday Street was cuffed by his master for staring at her through the shop window. The boy went red, the master apologized, and Grace was sent upstairs before the matter was settled. Her mother found her there and said only, "You must learn care." Care meant contradiction. If Grace smiled, she invited. If she refused, she was proud. If she covered herself, she was sly. If she was noticed, she had caused it. An old widow at the pump called her too fair for peace, and the words passed from mouth to mouth like something wise. By then, Grace understood that beauty was the only fault others could commit and leave upon her. The man who came for Grace was Master Michael Smith, a widower with a tall hat, clean cuffs, and a pew near the front, where all St Mildred's might see how dutifully he listened. He dealt in imported cloth, kept his accounts square, gave modestly when the churchwardens asked, and was old enough to understand the nature of a bargain before he offered one. He praised Grace carefully. He spoke of her modest bearing, her mother's good ordering, her father's honest trade, and only after these had been set down like respectable witnesses did he say that such fairness, joined to obedience, was a rare mercy in a wife. Her parents called it providence. Her mother said beauty had opened a door, and Grace must not be childish enough to fear the room beyond it. Her father spoke of comfort, sound walls, a proper table, and winter fuel bought before the frost. The neighbours said she was fortunate. The minister, when asked, spoke of order, duty, and the peace of a household rightly governed. Grace sat among them with her hands folded. She had learned by then that her face belonged partly to her family's hopes, and hope, when pressed by debt, could be as hard as greed. When the bargain was made, nobody named the price, because Grace sat at the table bearing it. In marriage, Master Smith showed her proudly. At church, at supper, in the shop doorway beside bolts of good wool, her beauty gave polish to his standing. Yet indoors, he watched it like property left too near an open window. If men admired her, she had been careless. If she lowered her eyes, she was practicing deceit. If she dressed plainly, she shamed his prosperity. If she looked tired, she was ungrateful. He had married her face and resented the woman who came with it. Years after, Grace Long came again to St Mildred's for the churching that followed her own child's baptism. The women knew before she reached the gate that something had altered, for she wore a veil thick enough for mourning, though Michael Smith walked beside her alive and well, his gloves new, his face composed, his parish place untouched. Whispers moved quicker than rainwater. "Pox," one said. "A fall," said another. A jealous husband breathed a third, and was hushed because Michael had paid for the repair. Her mother, older now and bent with bargains once called blessings, looked only at the stones. Cecily Scratcher waited beneath the lychgate, as she had waited for births, burials and reckonings between them. "Let them see," she said. Grace paused. Michael's hand tightened at her elbow, not enough for any man to call it force, only enough for every woman there to recognize it. Then Grace lifted the veil. There was no ruin, no scar, no pitted cheek or bruised eye. Her face was still fair, perhaps fairer for being carefully kept. She smiled with proper modesty before anyone had spoken. Her eyes lowered at the exact moment they ought. Gratitude, patience, obedience, and sweetness. Each appeared upon her face as neatly as pins on a cloth, and not one seemed to have travelled from the heart. There was no scar upon Grace Long. There was only obedience, arranged into the shape of a face. Cecily looked back to the present child in his linen, and the mother clutched him closer. "You see," she said, "Monday kept its word." Someone muttered that she was a bitter old woman. Someone else said beauty was still a gift. Cecily gently patted the bundle. "Praise the face if you must, but never make a cage of it." Tuesday's child is full of grace. At St Mildred's, the child was brought out under a white cloth. The rain had stopped, but water still fell from the church eaves in slow beads, striking the stones beside the lychgate. The mother, Jane Milton, held her son as if careful handling might help form the virtue being wished upon him. His father stood near, smelling faintly of yeast from the bakehouse, while the godparents spoke in approving voices. Cecily Scratcher waited where she always waited, half in the shelter of the lychgate, neither guest nor beggar, but something the parish had learned to step around. She had delivered too many infants, laid out too many corpses, and remembered too many dates to be dismissed as troublesome. "What day?" she asked. Jane Milton looked up, wary of the old woman's attention. "Tuesday, Mistress Scratcher, before the bakehouse fire was properly up." A pleased murmur went through the little company. Tuesday was a gentler word than the others. It carried no dangerous prettiness, no outward issue for men and women to quarrel over. The minister, passing behind them, heard the answer and allowed himself a nod. "Tuesday's child," Cecily said, "is full of grace." The godmother smiled. "A good blessing." "A holy one," said the minister. And in that year, when London men searched one another's sleeves for vanity and one another's speech for error, grace was a word that could sit safely in any mouth. It meant meekness, self-command, God's favour, a bridled tongue, and a child who would not shame his house. Cecily looked at baby Simon Milton, sleeping with one fist tucked beneath his chin. "Aye," she said, "but folk love grace best when it keeps a mouth shut." The mother's smile faltered, and Cecily watched it go. "Philip Cook was born into a bakehouse, and he learned that soon enough," she said. Philip Cook was not born meek. Cecily was particular on that point, for parish folk loved to turn a lesson into nature and so excuse the teaching of it. He had a strong cry and, when he first learned to stand, a stubborn way of setting his small feet apart as if the floor itself had argued with him. Yet he learned early what brought warmth. When the bakehouse was close and crowded, when Joan Cook had dough on her wrists and another child fretting at her skirt, Philip discovered that silence earned a softer glance than need. If he bumped his head and swallowed the cry, his mother kissed him twice and said, "There's my gracious boy, no trouble." If another child snatched his crust and Philip did not snatch it back, the neighbours praised him for a gentle spirit. If he was pushed, he was told it was good of him not to push again. If he apologised for quarrels he had not begun, adults looked relieved and called him blessed. "No trouble," they said, and said it as though they had named a virtue. His father liked him best in the hours when the ovens roared, and the household had no space for another demand. "Philip understands," he would say, though what Philip understood was only that peace could be bought by giving up his portion of it. Once, a pan of hot mash was knocked from the hearth and scalded his wrist. The maid cried out, the younger children scattered, and Philip stood white-faced, clutching his sleeve. Joan saw first that he had not screamed. "Brave heart," she said, before she asked who had done it. Before Philip knew what grace was, he well understood other people's comfort. He learned to fold pain small, to make room for blame, and to smile when surrender pleased the room. As Philip grew, the cooks found uses for his quietness beyond the bakehouse. A boy who did not answer back could be sent where louder souls would worsen matters. So he carried apologies through Bread Street as other boys carried loaves, warm from the making by others. If his brother struck a smaller child, Philip was told to take him by the hand and make peace of it. If his father spoke too sharply to Joan before the bakehouse lads, Philip was praised for beginning a psalm at supper and smoothing the silence. If a journeyman was cheated of rest, Philip was sent to sit beside him with Scripture until the man grew ashamed of his own anger. He was not asked what was just. He was asked to make things quiet. "Philip has such grace," they said. The minister liked him for it. When other children fidgeted, Philip sat still. When rebuked, he accepted correction quickly. When insulted, he did not repay it. He was told this was Christian. He was told a bridled tongue pleased God. He was told wrath lived close to pride, and that a soft answer turned away fury. No one told him fury sometimes deserved to meet a door bolted shut. By 13 he had become useful to half the parish. Sick neighbours wanted him at their beds because he listened without burdening them with himself. Offended kin sent for him because he could carry forgiveness before repentance had been offered. Neighbours whispered their wrongs to him and were told by others that Master Philip would pray with them. If Philip objected, he lacked grace. If he suffered, he was full of it. If he forgave, others were spared the labour of amendment. If he remembered, he was warned against hardness of heart. They handed him every sharp thing in Bread Street and praised the gentleness of his grip. Philip's grace did not remain a household habit. By manhood it had become parish property. The church wardens found use for him first. There were visits that went more easily with Philip in the doorway. Unpaid rates, disputed relief, idle boys to be warned, widows to be made grateful for less than they needed. He was not an officer, which made him better. A soft voice can enter where a hard one is expected and do the hard voice's work. So when widow Alice Fox came to St Mildred's vestry with her youngest child coughing in her shawl, and said the coal allowed her would not carry them through the frost, Philip was asked to sit beside her. The wardens had already decided. There were poorer souls, they said, soberer souls, souls less given to complaint. Alice's husband had left debts. Her eldest boy had been seen near an alehouse. The parish could not reward disorder. Alice listened until her mouth trembled. "My child is cold," she said. "A great many are cold, Widow Fox," said one warden. Philip was expected to speak up at that moment. He knew the look. It had followed him from hearth to sickbed to vestry bench. "Make this easier for us." He took Alice's rough hand between his own and told her the Lord saw patience. He told her that murmuring would not warm a room. He told her she must receive what was given with a quiet heart, and heard as he spoke how neatly cruelty could borrow scripture and go about dressed as care. Alice looked at him, and for one bare moment he thought she might curse them all. But instead she lowered her eyes. The wardens thanked Philip afterwards. The matter, they said, had been settled with admirable grace. Cecily Scratcher heard of it before nightfall. "Settled," she said. "Aye, so is dust on a coffin." Widow Alice Fox was sent away with half a sack of coal and a lesson in patience. Philip Cook took to sitting at the back of St Mildred's before the service. He came early, while the church was still dim, and carried the breath of those who had entered with troubles they meant to call prayers. He was not old, but he had begun to move as though every grievance in Bread Street had passed through his hands and left something on him. People still asked for him. Each time Philip went. Each time some hurt was made quieter. Each time he was thanked. Then Alice Fox's youngest died. No one said the coal would have saved him. No one said it would not. The wardens spoke of God's will. The minister preached on submission beneath the rod. Alice stood by the grave with her shawl pulled tight, and did not weep where anyone could comfort themselves by seeing it. Philip stood apart. Afterwards, Cecily found him by the lychgate. His face was composed. His voice, when he spoke, was gentle enough to make any parish praise him. "I told her to be quiet," he said. Cecily looked at his sleeves. "Show me." For a moment he did not move. Then he drew out his hands. His nails had bitten half moons into both palms, deep enough that blood had dried in the cuts. "Full of grace," Cecily said, but there was no praise in it. That was the tale she gave them beneath the lychgate, while Jane Milton held her child and the last drops fell from the church eaves. The godmother looked down at Simon Milton, still asleep beneath his white cloth, and at last someone muttered that grace was still a virtue. "Aye," said Cecily, "so it is." She stepped closer to the child, not touching him, only looking. "Teach grace if you must," she said, "but teach first what must not be endured." Wednesday's child is full of woe. The child came out of St Mildred's under pewter skies. Annie Walton held her daughter close beneath the clean wrap, eager for home, broth, and a closed door. John Walton walked beside her with the strained face of a man who had heard the rhyme already and wished no one else remembered it. Baby Ruth Walton had not cried. Not when the minister touched the water to her brow, not when the godmother shifted her awkwardly, not when cold air met her face outside the church door. Her eyes stayed open, watching the beams, the stones, and the faces bending over her. At the lychgate, Cecily Scratcher waited. "What day?" she asked. John shrugged. "Wednesday." No pleased murmur followed. A godmother's hand twitched at her breast before she thought better of the old gesture. Someone said the child seemed peaceful enough, and another muttered that rhymes were old women's chatter. Cecily looked down at Ruth. "Wednesday's child is full of woe." Annie's arms tightened around her daughter. "Full, aye," Cecily said. "But full is not the same as sad." Then she raised her face to the listeners. "There was a Wednesday child once, Abigail Young. She never wept when she ought." Abigail Young had been baptised on a Wednesday in a poorer winter, when frost lay inside the window panes and the water in the font was cold enough to make the godmother flinch. Her mother waited for the child's protest. The minister waited too, with his thumb wet above her brow. Abigail made no sound. They laughed at first, because a quiet babe was counted a mercy in a narrow room. She did not cry later when hunger pinched her, nor when cold reddened her hands, nor when a dropped pan split the sleep of the house. Her mother called her peaceful, until peaceful began to feel like a word for something no one wished to examine. As Abigail grew, grief altered near her. When her mother wept over a debt that could not be paid, Abigail came and laid one hand upon her sleeve. The tears stopped so suddenly that the woman looked ashamed. When a widow from Friday Street held Abigail after her husband's burial, the widow drew one long breath and said the weight had gone from her chest. A man raging in the lane over a brother drowned below the bridge fell quiet when Abigail looked up at him, and afterwards could not find the sharpness of what he had been saying. At first folk called it comfort. They did not fetch Abigail about like physic. They did not understand enough to sin so plainly. Yet the pattern found its own path through Bread Street. People left her presence lighter, blinking in the sudden ease of it. Abigail left heavier. Other people's sorrow did not make her weep. It found room in her and sat down. She slept long after funerals, woke with names she had never been told, and watched empty corners. At first the Young house seemed blessed by Abigail's strangeness. Her mother, once quick to tears when the rent came due or bread ran short, found herself recovering before the neighbours could pity her. Her father's temper, sharpened by long work and small earnings, lost its edge when Abigail sat near the hearth. A quarrel that should have lasted until morning would fade by supper. A grief that might have bent a week out of shape was gone before the next bell. They said Abigail had a calming spirit. They said some children brought noise into a house and some brought peace. After bad news, those who had stood near her slept well. After burials, they ate with appetite sooner than seemed decent, then praised God for giving them strength. But Cecily Scratcher knew strength from forgetting. A woman in Pudding Lane ceased visiting the little grave where her daughter lay, because the loss no longer pressed upon her. A man who had wronged his dead brother over a debt remembered the quarrel plainly enough, yet felt no need to put money aside for the widow. A merchant who had cheated a poor woman in the weighing of cloth crossed Abigail's path, went home light-hearted, and called his ease forgiveness. That was when comfort began to smell bad. For sorrow is not only pain. it is remembrance. It is the hand laid upon a grave, the debt paid late because conscience would not sleep, the empty chair left empty a while because love had sat there. There is woe that ruins a life, Cecily said, and woe that keeps a soul from wilting. By 12 years old, Abigail Young looked like any other skinny London child. Thin wrists, mended sleeves, hair pinned badly when her mother hurried, shoes grown tight before there was money for another pair. Yet the woe she carried had begun to show in ways no parish account could mark. Small stones gathered in her pockets, smooth and dark, though no one had seen her pick them up. When she passed a candle, the flame bent towards her and guttered blue at the root. The birds that bickered in the churchyard wall went quiet until she had gone by. In dry weather, her shoes left damp prints on the boards. Then came the matter of Emily Brown. She was a washerwoman, owed 3 months' pay by a merchant's wife who had taken clean linen every Monday and sent excuses every Friday. Emily's youngest had a fever. Her rent was called in. The merchant's wife spoke of confusion, household pressures, unfortunate timing, and promised settlement when matters allowed. By then the child was already wrapped in a sheet. There should have been anger. There should have been shame sharp enough to cut through the parish. Instead, Abigail stood near the churchyard path when they came from the burial, and the grief waned as people passed her. Emily stopped shaking. The merchant's wife slept that night. Neighbours said it was a mercy that the poor woman bore it so well. Abigail went home with river stones in both hands and a dead child's name on her tongue. She had never broken her heart, yet it beat as though it had broken 100 times. The woe came back on a burial morning, when the church was half full and nobody had thought to fear Abigail Young. Emily Brown sat in the 3rd pew, dry-eyed beneath her cap. The merchant's wife sat 2 rows behind, composed in good black wool. The minister had opened the book and begun to speak of earthly frailty when the bell sounded once above them. No hand was on the rope. Every face lifted. Then Abigail, standing near the north wall with her mother's hand upon her shoulder, gave one long breath, and all that had been misplaced returned to its owners. Emily Brown made a sound no sermon could contain. She bent forward with both hands over her mouth, and the name of her dead child broke through her fingers. The merchant's wife stiffened as though a hook had caught behind her ribs. Her fine gloves went to her stomach. Later she would send payment, and more than payment, but in that moment she only understood hunger arriving too late. Others remembered too. A man heard again the last words of the brother he had cheated. A mother who had been praised for recovering well after loss in birth cried until the pew shook. Even the minister lost his place, staring at the burial page as if each neat entry had acquired a voice. Abigail stood among them lighter than she had been for years. Not happy, only less crowded. When Cecily Scratcher told it at the lychgate, Annie Walton looked down at Ruth, whose dark eyes were still open beneath the christening cloth. "Wednesday's child is full of woe," she said. "That never meant she was made to keep it." John Walton shifted as if to speak, but Ruth gave a sharp cry. Annie did not hush her. "Let her have her own tears," said Cecily, "and see no one pours theirs into her to save themselves the salt." Thursday's child has far to go. Isaac Taylor came out of St Mildred's wakeful. Jenny Taylor held her son well wrapped, yet his head turned at every sound beyond her arm. A cartwheel in the street, a shout from a shop front, water dropping from the lychgate beam. Each small noise drew him, and his eyes opened wide to a world that seemed to call from every corner. Edmund Taylor smiled at that. He was tired, proud, and full of the plain hopes fathers put upon sons before the sons have strength enough to refuse them. "Lively lad," said a neighbour. "He'll not be one for sitting long." "At least he looks ready for the world," said another, and Edmund's smile deepened. Cecily Scratcher waited at the lychgate. "What day?" she asked. Jenny glanced down at Isaac before answering. "Thursday." No one shrank from it. Thursday carried no dread. A boy with far to go sounded like promise, advancement, better wages, wider streets, perhaps a life larger than his father's. "Thursday's child has far to go," Cecily said. Edmund nodded. "There are worse blessings." "Aye," said Cecily, "but far is not always forward." She looked past Isaac's restless eyes. "I remember another Thursday child, Matthew Cooper." Matthew Cooper was Sarah and Joshua's second child, born on a Thursday, in a room above a shop where hoops, staves, and the smell of worked wood made the air dry. He was not sickly or mournful. He was loved well enough, fed well enough, and held often enough to satisfy any child. Yet he would not settle. In arms, Matthew looked past the shoulder that held him. Set in the cradle, he turned his face towards the stair. When he could crawl, Sarah found him at thresholds, the chamber door, the stairhead, the yard gate, the front step where the street showed itself in a narrow slice between houses. He did not cry to be elsewhere. That would have been simpler. He watched, solemn and eager, waiting for some next place to declare itself. Sarah noticed first and was troubled. Joshua just laughed because it pleased him to think the boy was eager. "Spirit," he said. "Curiosity. A boy should have some looking out in him." The neighbours had their answer ready. Thursday's child has far to go. They said it over him when he pulled towards the shop front, when he leaned from Sarah's arms to follow a passing cart, and when he took his first steps towards the open door. As Matthew grew, it became harder to mistake it for ordinary curiosity, though. If sent on an errand, he took the long way and came home flushed with pleasure until the latch closed behind him. If kept indoors, he sat where he could see a hinge, a gap, or a strip of street light under the door. Arrival wearied him. The going pleased him. The almost going pleased him most. Christopher Miller came through Bread Street with a carrier's book in his coat, mud dried pale on his boots, and news enough to buy a welcome in half the doorways. He was not a rogue. That was the danger of him. He knew wharves, inn-yards, warehouses, river stairs, market towns, and the names of men who needed small parcels carried with care. He paid what he owed. He spoke respectfully to mothers. He noticed boys who watched streets more closely than they watched sermons. Matthew was 13 when Christopher first found him lingering by the shop front after an errand should have ended. A cart had turned towards Cheapside, and Matthew had stood following it with his eyes until the crowd swallowed it. "You look," Christopher said, like a lad kept too long in one lane." Matthew flushed because the words felt like permission. After that, Christopher gave him little errands: a note to a warehouse near the river, a packet to a clerk by Paul's yard, a message to a household beyond Ludgate. Matthew returned each time breathless and bright, carrying the city back on his clothes. Tar, dung, ale, rainwater, and smoke from other chimneys. Sarah Cooper saw the brightness and feared it. Joshua saw it too and tried to make pride of it. Christopher spoke of usefulness, advancement, a clever lad not wasting himself under one ceiling. It was respectable language. It had wages in it. It had a future in it. Worse, it sounded like the rhyme coming true. Soon Bread Street altered after every return. The room above the shop seemed smaller. The yard gate looked like an insult. His mother's voice came too near. His father's work stood before him like a wall. Home was no longer the place Matthew belonged. It was the place leaving began. He left first for 3 days, then for 7, then for a month that carried Lent into spring. He rode beside carts, counted bales, slept above stables, waited at river stairs while fog lifted from the Thames, delivered folded papers to men who barely looked up before sending him elsewhere. His boots wore thin at the heel, his hands cracked in the cold. He ate bread in yards where no one knew his name. At first, letters came. Sarah kept them folded in a small box beneath her linen. Joshua read them aloud, standing by the hearth. To him, each word proved the boy had risen. Matthew wrote of wages honestly paid, of men who trusted him with accounts, of Oxford Road mud, Kingston rain, Ware inns, Brentford barges, and market bells in towns where a clever lad might yet do well. Bread Street approved. Thursday's child, they said, had found his road. Then the letters altered. People fell out of them first. Matthew could name the inn sign, but not the host. He remembered the colour of a milestone, but not the man who walked beside him half a day. He described a bridge in careful strokes, the loose plank, the mossed stone, the smell of riverweed below it, yet forgot whether he had crossed it with hunger or laughter. Places mattered only while they were not yet reached. He left good situations because they had become known. A warehouse that had seemed full of promise soured once he could find his way through it without thinking. A lodging turned hateful after his boots learned the stair. Wherever Matthew stopped, the place spoiled. Sarah waited for a letter saying he had settled. Joshua said a young man must make his way. Christopher Miller, when asked, gave a carrier's shrug and said some roads were given, not chosen. But Matthew was no longer following a road. He was being followed by distance, and however far he went, he kept walking ahead. Matthew Cooper came back to Bread Street on a wet evening in November, 3 days after Sarah was laid in St Mildred's earth. Joshua had sent word months before, then weeks before, then at the last through a carrier who knew 3 roads Matthew might be found upon. Whether the message reached him in time, no one could say. He appeared at the mouth of Bread Street after dusk, with rain on his hat, dust on his coat, and boots wet from more miles than London mud could account for. He stood there a long while. Those who saw him said he looked towards the Cooper house and did not move. The shutters were lit. Joshua sat within, old all at once, with Sarah's chair drawn near the hearth, because no one yet had courage to move it. Matthew could see the window. He could see the door. He had crossed counties, bridges, markets, and river roads to reach that place. Still, he did not arrive. At last he came as far as the lychgate and put one hand upon the wet wood. When he spoke to Cecily Scratcher, his voice carried wheels, river water, indoors and winter fields. "I meant to come sooner." "Aye," Cecily said. "Roads are full of men meaning to turn back." He could name every town he had passed through. He knew which inn had bad ale, which ford ran deep, where a milestone leaned, and where a dog had followed him 1/2 a mile. But he could not remember the last thing his mother said before he left. "He had far to go," Cecily told Jenny Taylor beneath the lychgate all those years after. "And so he went. That was the pity. No one taught him that a road may be refused." Edmund shifted. "A child must make his way." "Aye," Cecily said, "but teach him the difference between road and running." That was The 7 Blessings of Cecily Scratcher, Part 1, by Jonathan B. Edvane. Discover more at edvanestories.com.